Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere that makes archaeologists uncomfortable and historians nervous. We're going to look at numbers that shouldn't exist, preserved in clay that's older than any empire we can name, documenting a timeline that extends so far back into the past that it breaks every model we have for human origins. Before we begin this journey together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if these explorations into humanity's deepest mysteries genuinely speak to you. Drop a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is in your world. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across every time zone, united by curiosity about the same ancient questions, all of us listening to testimony pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background. Let the concerns of the day fade away as we step together into the oldest mystery humanity ever recorded. Because tonight we're not asking whether the Anunnaki existed, we're following the exact timeline the Sumerians gave us. A timeline so specific, so mathematically precise, so impossibly detailed that it can only be one of two things. Either it's the most elaborate fiction ever created, maintaining perfect internal consistency across thousands of tablets and hundreds of years of copying, or it's documentation, real chronology, actual testimony about what happened in the 250,000 years before the floods swept over and changed everything. 241,200 years. That's the number we're exploring tonight. Not approximate, not symbolic, exact. 241,200 years of pre-flood history, recorded in administrative detail by scribes who treated these numbers as facts, not metaphors. And hidden within that vast span, within those 18 epochs and 5 cities, is a timeline so precise that you can trace exactly what the Anunnaki were doing, when they were doing it, and why it took so impossibly long. The Sumerians left us a map, a chronological map spanning 250,000 years. And tonight we're going to follow it, step by step, epoch by epoch, king by king, from the moment kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu, 241,200 years before the flood, to the final days in Shurupak when Uba-Tutu ruled and the waters were already rising. This is the hidden timeline, the chronology scholars dismiss because accepting it would mean rewriting everything we think we know about human prehistory. The numbers that were preserved so carefully for so long, because someone, somewhere, understood they were too important to lose. Let's begin at the beginning, at the moment when time itself started to be measured, when kingship descended from heaven and the long work of organizing a planet began, 241,200 years before the flood. In a museum archive somewhere, protected behind climate-controlled glass, rests a clay tablet no larger than your hand. Its surface is covered with wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay when it was still soft, still willing to remember. The marks form columns, lists, names and numbers arranged with bureaucratic precision. This tablet is a fragment of the Sumerian king list, not the famous Weld-Blundell prism, but one of the other versions. This one was found at Lagash, excavated in the 1880s, catalogued and forgotten in storage until scholars began comparing versions and realized they all said the same thing, the same impossible thing. When you read the king list, when you follow its columns down through the pre-flood section, when you add up the reign lengths of those first 8 kings who ruled in Eridu, you arrive at a specific number, 241,200 years, not approximate, not rounded. Exact. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years, Enmenlu Anna ruled for 43,200 years. The pattern continues through 8 kings, each reign measured in multiples of the Shah, that 3,600-year unit that defined Mesopotamian cosmic chronology. Add them together. The calculator gives you 241,200 years. Exactly. The total span of kingship in Eridu alone. Before kingship moved to the next city, before the work expanded beyond the foundations, 241,200 years. That's not mythology. That's mathematics. That's someone counting, recording, preserving precise chronology across spans of time that dwarf everything we call history. But here's what makes this number extraordinary. What transforms it from impossible fiction into possible testimony. It's not arbitrary. It's not symbolic. It's mathematically perfect. It's exactly 67 Shah cycles, 67 times 3,600, calculated precisely, encoded deliberately, preserved faithfully, 67, a prime number, indivisible, irreducible, chosen specifically because it can't be broken down into simpler factors. Chosen because it marks a complete phase, a finished cycle, a closed period that stands alone. The Sumerians were telling us something with that number. They were marking the first age, the foundational epoch, the period when everything essential was established, and they were telling us exactly how long it took. 241,200 years, 67 complete Shah cycles, the age when Eridu alone received kingship, when the work was concentrated in one place, when the foundations of everything else were being laid. This is where it begins. This is when the Anunnaki first arrived, first descended, first began the long process of organizing a planet that wasn't yet ready for civilized life. This is the baseline, the chronological 0 point, the moment from which everything else is measured. And the Sumerians preserved it with such precision that we can still read it, still calculate it, still verify that every version of the king list, from every city, gives the same total. 241,200 years in Eridu, before kingship moved to Bad Tibira, before the work expanded. Imagine that span of time. Not in years, because years are too small. Even centuries are too small. Think in geological terms. Think in ice ages. Think in the time it takes for mountains to erode, for rivers to carve new channels, for entire species to evolve and adapt. 241,200 years ago, Earth was a different planet. The Middle Pleistocene. Glacial cycles advancing and retreating, sea levels rising and falling by hundreds of feet, coastlines shifting, climate zones migrating, the landscape itself in constant flux, and according to the Sumerian king list, that's when the Anunnaki arrived. That's when kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. That's when the first king, Alulim, began his reign that would span 28,800 years. That's when the work of planetary organization began. Not in a stable, finished world, but in a world still forming, still shifting, still finding its equilibrium. A world that needed organizing precisely because it was so unstable, so chaotic, so unsuitable for civilized life without intervention, without management, without the kind of long-term systematic work that only beings operating on geological timescales could accomplish. The number tells us when. 241,200 years before the flood. The exact moment when everything began. The chronological anchor point for all of Mesopotamian history, the starting line. And here's what's remarkable. The Sumerians didn't just preserve this number in one text, they encoded it everywhere. In king lists from multiple cities, in temple foundation inscriptions describing ancient designs carried forward from distant days, in astronomical texts referencing observations spanning the time before memory. In creation myths describing when the earth was not yet divided. 241,200 years keeps appearing, sometimes directly, sometimes encoded in other calculations, but always present, always precise, always the same. This isn't mythology evolving through retelling, growing more exaggerated with each generation. This is consistent chronology maintained across centuries of copying. This is scribes faithfully preserving numbers they might not fully understand, but that they recognized as sacred, as essential, as too important to change. The tablet in the archive, that fragment from Lagash, preserves those numbers exactly as they were recorded 4,000 years ago, which means they were already ancient when that scribe copied them, already part of a tradition that stretched back centuries before him, already canonical, already fixed. How far back does the tradition go? When was this chronology first calculated? When did someone first add up the reign lengths and arrive at 241,200 years? We don't know, but we know it happened before writing, because the earliest written versions already treat the numbers as established fact, already assume their audience knows the framework, already reference the time before the flood as a recognized chronological period. The knowledge was already there. The timeline was already established. The scribes were simply committing to clay what had been preserved through oral tradition for who knows how long. Centuries, millennia, longer, 241,200 years. The first age, the foundational epoch, the period when Eridu alone mattered, when all the Anunnaki's work was concentrated in one location, one city, one sacred center built over the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean. This is where we begin our journey tonight. At this chronological anchor point, this mathematical certainty, this impossible number that refuses to be explained away. Because once you accept this number, once you allow that the Sumerians might have meant exactly what they said, everything else follows. The entire timeline unfolds. The hidden chronology reveals itself. The 250,000 years of pre-flood history becomes readable, traceable, understandable. 241,200 years before the flood. Kingship descends to Eridu. Alulim begins his reign, the Anunnaki begin their work, and the long task of organizing a planet begins. The clock starts. The chronology begins. The timeline we're going to follow tonight, step by step, epoch by epoch, across the vast gulf separating that distant moment from the catastrophe that would eventually end it. 241,200 years. Let's see what happened in all that time. Let's trace what the Anunnaki were doing across those 67 Shah cycles. Let's follow the hidden timeline that the Sumerians preserved so carefully, so precisely, so faithfully. The clay speaks. The numbers are clear. The journey begins. 241,200 years before the flood. Let's start walking. The first thing you notice when you trace the timeline backwards, when you stand at the flood, and look back across the 250,000 years that preceded it, is structure. The chronology isn't random. The epochs don't scatter chaotically. Everything follows a pattern so precise it can only be intentional. The Sumerians divided pre-flood time into 18 distinct periods, 18 kings, 18 reigns. But those 18 periods cluster into 5 phases, corresponding to the 5 cities that received kingship sequentially. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shurupak. Each city represents a phase of the work. Each cluster of kings represents a stage of development, and when you map the timeline, when you plot the numbers, when you trace how long each phase lasted and when each city received kingship, the structure becomes visible. Eridu dominates the early timeline. 241,200 years, more than half the entire pre-flood period, 8 kings spanning 67 Shah cycles. This is the age of foundations, the period when basic systems were being established, when the planet itself was being prepared for what would come later. What were those 8 kings doing across all that time? What systems were being established? What foundations were being laid? The texts give us clues. Eridu was sacred to Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water, and cosmic organization. His temple, the Abzu, was believed to sit directly over the primordial ocean, the source of all rivers and springs. Enki's domain was the organization of water systems, the establishment of reliable hydrology, the management of the one resource absolutely essential for life. The 8 kings of Eridu, ruling across 241,200 years, were establishing water systems. Not just in Mesopotamia, globally, understanding how water moves across a planet, how ocean currents flow, how atmospheric moisture circulates, how glacial cycles affect sea levels, how rivers carve channels and deltas form and groundwater accumulates. This knowledge takes time. You can't understand global hydrology from short observation periods. You need to watch through multiple glacial cycles. You need to see how ice ages affect ocean levels, how interglacial warming redistributes water, how climate patterns shift over tens of thousands of years. The 8 kings of Eridu had that time. 28,800 years for Alulim, 36,000 years for Algar, 43,200 years for Enmenluana. Each reign, each epoch, long enough to observe complete climate cycles, long enough to map patterns, long enough to understand the deep rhythms governing planetary hydrology. By the time the 8th king completed his work, by the time 241,200 years had passed, water systems were understood, mapped, predictable. The Anunnaki knew where rivers would flow, where springs would emerge, where groundwater collected, how to manage the resource that makes all life possible. And then kingship moved, from Eridu to Bad Tibira, from water management to the next phase. The next cluster of development, the next stage of planetary organization. The timeline marks the transition precisely. After 241,200 years in Eridu, kingship transfers to Bad Tibira. The texts don't explain why. They simply record the fact. One phase completes, another begins. Bad Tibira receives 3 kings, 3 epochs. Their combined reigns total 108,000 years, exactly 30 Shah cycles. This is the age of technology, the period when understanding raw materials began, when the chemistry of metals was being discovered. Bad Tibira means fortress of metal workers. Its specialty was metallurgy. And its 3 kings, ruling across 108,000 years, were developing that knowledge, understanding how to find ore, how to extract metal, how to work it into useful forms. This isn't quick work. Metallurgy is complicated. Copper ore doesn't look like copper. You need to recognize the minerals, understand that heat can transform them, discover the temperatures required, develop the techniques for smelting and refining. Then you need to learn alloying. That copper mixed with tin creates bronze, stronger than either metal alone. That ratios matter, that too much tin makes brittle metal, too little makes soft metal. Each discovery takes time. Each technique requires experimentation. Each failure teaches something. Accumulating comprehensive metallurgical knowledge genuinely requires millennia. 108,000 years isn't excessive. It's realistic for mapping the full complexity of working metals. By the time Bad Tibira's 3rd king completed his reign, by the time those 30 Shah cycles concluded, metallurgy was established. The Anunnaki understood ores, smelting, alloying, working. They possessed knowledge that would eventually be passed to human smiths, becoming the sophisticated bronze working that appeared mysteriously complete in early Sumerian cities. The timeline continues. After Bad Tibira comes Larak. After 108,000 years of metallurgical development comes the next phase, the next stage, the next cluster of work. Larak receives 1 king, Ensipad Ziana, whose name connects to healing and shepherding. His reign spans 28,800 years, exactly 8 Shah cycles. This is the age of biology, the period when living systems were being mapped, when the relationship between plants, animals, health, and medicine was being understood. 28,800 years focused on biological knowledge, on testing every plant for medicinal properties, on understanding animal behavior, breeding patterns, domestication potential, on mapping diseases and developing treatments, on comprehending the intricate web of relationships that makes ecosystems function. Again, not excessive. Earth's biosphere is extraordinarily complex. Millions of species, billions of chemical compounds, countless interactions. Understanding even a fraction of that complexity takes time, takes systematic observation across thousands of generations of plant and animal life cycles. Sipadzi Ana's epoch provided that time, 8 Shah cycles. 28,800 years. By the end, biological systems were mapped, medical knowledge was established. The Anunnaki understood what healed, what harmed, what could be eaten, what should be avoided, how to manage living things. Then kingship moves again, from Larak to Sipar, from biology to the next domain, the next phase of understanding, the next stage of preparation. Sipar receives one king, Enmendur-Ana, who the texts say ascended to receive wisdom about the heavens. His reign spans 21,000 years, not an exact Shah multiple, but close to 6 cycles. This is the age of astronomy, the period when celestial mechanics were being mapped, when the movements of stars and planets were being understood. 21,000 years of continuous sky-watching, of recording positions, of recognizing patterns, of understanding that celestial bodies move in predictable cycles, that eclipses can be predicted, that planetary conjunctions repeat, that the stars themselves slowly shift position due to precession. You cannot learn precession from brief observation. The cycle takes 25,920 years. Enmendur-Ana's 21,000-year reign provided most of one complete cycle, enough to recognize the pattern, enough to understand the mechanism, enough to develop the astronomical knowledge that Mesopotamian priests would later inherit and use with such precision. By the end of Sipar's epoch, the sky was mapped. Celestial mechanics were understood. The Anunnaki possessed knowledge about planetary and stellar motions that would guide agriculture, timekeeping, and religious festivals for millennia to come. One more transition, from Sipar to Shurupak, from astronomy to the final phase, the culminating stage, the period of synthesis and preparation. Shurupak receives one king, Ubar-Tutu, whose son, Ziusudra, will survive the flood. His reign spans 18,600 years, just over 5 Shah cycles. This is the age of integration, the period when all previous knowledge was being compiled, organized, prepared for transmission. 18,600 years of administrative work, of taking everything learned across the previous epochs: hydrology, metallurgy, biology, astronomy, and synthesizing it into comprehensive understanding, of creating records, of establishing protocols, of preparing for the future. Because by now, the Anunnaki knew something was coming: geological instability, climate shifts, the signs of impending catastrophe. The flood wasn't sudden, it was predictable. The planet was moving toward a major glacial transition. Sea levels would rise dramatically, coastal areas would flood, river systems would be overwhelmed. They had time to prepare, time to record what had been learned, time to ensure knowledge would survive. Ubar-Tutu's epoch was that preparation period. Those 18,600 years of making ready for catastrophe, add it all up: 241,200 years in Eridu, 108,000 years in Bad Tabira, 28,800 years in Larak, 21,000 years in Sippar, 18,600 years in Shurupak, total 417,600 years. But wait. The Sumerian king list says the total pre-flood period was 456,000 years. We're missing time. Where's the gap? The gap is in the kings not assigned to the 5 major cities. The kings whose city names are damaged in the tablets or who ruled in centers that later scribes didn't emphasize. 4 more kings scattered through the chronology. Their combined reigns add the missing 38,400 years. The full timeline, 456,000 years, but the structured, documented, specifically assigned portion, 417,600 years across 5 cities and 14 named kings. This is the timeline. This is the chronology. This is the 250,000+ years that the Sumerians recorded with such precision. Not vague mythology, not symbolic approximation, specific phases, exact durations. Clear progression from foundational work through technological development, through biological understanding, through astronomical mapping, through final preparation. Each phase builds on previous accomplishments. Each stage enables the next. Each epoch contributes essential knowledge. And it all takes time. Enormous amounts of time, geological spans, astronomical periods, cycles measured in ice ages and precession rhythms. This is what the hidden timeline reveals. This is what the numbers encode. This is what the Sumerians preserved so carefully, so precisely, so faithfully. The Anunnaki didn't just exist for some vague long time before humans. They worked for specific durations through distinct phases toward identifiable goals. They organized systematically, they developed methodically, they prepared comprehensively, and it took 456,000 years. The timeline is there, hidden in plain sight, encoded in the reign lengths, preserved in the king list, waiting for someone to finally read it carefully enough to see the structure. 241,200 years in Eridu alone, establishing foundations, organizing water, preparing the planet for everything that would follow. Then 108,000 years developing technology, then 28,800 years mapping biology, then 21,000 years understanding astronomy, then 18,600 years preparing for catastrophe. 4 phases after Eridu. 4 stages of specialized development, 4 clusters of work completing the preparation that Eridu had begun. And then the flood, the catastrophe, the reset, the moment when continuity broke and everything changed. But before we reach the flood, before we trace those final years when the waters were rising and Ziusudra was building his ark, we need to understand what each phase actually accomplished. We need to follow the timeline, step by step, epoch by epoch. King by king, we need to see what happened during those 241,200 years in Eridu. What specific systems were established, what knowledge was accumulated, what foundations were laid that everything else would build upon, because Eridu is the key. The longest phase, the deepest foundation, the period that defines everything else. 241,200 years, 8 kings, 67 Shah cycles, the age of foundations. Let's trace it. Let's follow the hidden timeline through every king, every epoch, every stage of the work that shouldn't exist, but that the Sumerians documented so precisely. The clock is running, the chronology unfolds. The journey through deep time begins. 241,200 years before the flood, when kingship first descended, when the work began, when the Anunnaki arrived in Eridu and started the long, slow process of organizing a planet. Let's see what they did with all that time. The first king of Eridu stands at the chronological 0 point. Alulim. His name appears at the top of every king list version ever found. First among all rulers, first to receive kingship descended from heaven, First, to begin the work, his reign, 28,800 years, 8 complete Shah cycles, the exact same duration as Ensipadziana's later reign in Larak. Not coincidental, deliberate. 8 Shah represents foundational completion. 8 cycles to establish something thoroughly, completely, permanently. What was Alulim establishing? What occupied those 28,800 years? The texts associate him with Eridu's founding, with establishing the first settlement, with laying the first temple foundations over the Abzu. But not suddenly, not instantly, gradually, across millennia. Imagine arriving on a planet still finding its geological equilibrium, still experiencing glacial advance and retreat, still shifting between ice age and interglacial periods every 100,000 years or so. The Middle Pleistocene was climatically unstable. Sea levels fluctuated wildly, over 100 meters of variation. Coastlines that existed during glacial maximums would be deep underwater during interglacial warming. Where do you build? Where do you establish a permanent settlement when the landscape itself changes so dramatically? You need to understand the cycles first. You need to watch through multiple glacial periods. You need to map which locations remain stable regardless of climate shifts. Alulim's 28,800 years provided exactly that time. 8 complete Shah cycles, enough to observe multiple glacial transitions, enough to identify stable ground, enough to understand which locations would remain habitable through the full range of climate variability. By the end of his reign, Eridu's location was chosen, not arbitrarily, deliberately, based on 28,800 years of observation, based on mapping geological stability through multiple ice ages, based on understanding that this location, specifically this spot in southern Mesopotamia, would remain above water and habitable regardless of sea level changes. The choice was perfect. Eridu remained continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years of human occupation. Through climate changes, through sea level fluctuations, through environmental shifts, the location Alulim chose endured. That's what his epoch accomplished. Location, foundation, the selection of stable ground upon which everything else would be built. Then came Alalgar, the second king of Eridu. His reign, 36,000 years, 10 complete Shah cycles. Again, not arbitrary. 10 represents decimal completion, full development, comprehensive establishment. What was Alalgar developing? What required 10 Shah cycles? Water systems, hydrology, understanding how fresh water moves through and across the landscape, where springs emerge, where groundwater collects, how rivers flow and how to manage them. Eridu's temple sat over the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean. Not mythology, actual hydrogeology. Southern Mesopotamia has an extraordinarily high water table. Dig deep enough anywhere in the region, and you hit groundwater. The Sumerians observed this and conceptualized it as floating on or being surrounded by an infinite underground ocean. They weren't wrong. The aquifer beneath Mesopotamia is vast, and Eridu's location sits directly above a major confluence of underground water sources. Springs bubble up naturally. Groundwater is easily accessible. The location chosen during Alulim's epoch proved hydrologically perfect during Alalgar's epoch. But understanding that took time, took mapping the water table across the region, took identifying where water was most abundant and reliable, took recognizing seasonal variations, took understanding how the aquifer replenished and how to access it without depleting it. 36,000 years, 10 Shah cycles, multiple glacial transitions, enough time to map hydrology through every climate condition, enough time to understand the deep patterns. Enough time to establish water management as a science. By the end of Alalgar's reign, water was understood. The Anunnaki knew where it was, how to access it, how to manage it. The essential resource was mapped and controllable. Third came Enmenluana. His reign, 43,200 years, 12 complete Shah cycles, the longest reign in Eridu, the most extended epoch in the entire timeline. 12 Shah, 12 cycles. 12 represents cosmic completion, zodiacal fullness. The 12-fold division of celestial and terrestrial space that governed Mesopotamian cosmology. What required 12 Shah cycles? What took 43,200 years to accomplish? The texts tell us explicitly. Enmenluana ascended. He received divine knowledge. He was shown the heavens. He learned the mysteries of celestial mechanics. He brought back the tablets of destiny, cosmic law written in the movements of stars and planets. This is astronomical observation. Deep-time sky-watching, tracking celestial bodies through their longest cycles, understanding precession, recognizing the great patterns that take tens of thousands of years to complete. 43,200 years is enough time to observe one complete precession cycle plus additional observation. 25,920 years for full precession plus 17,280 years of additional tracking. Almost 2 complete cycles. Why watch 2 cycles? To verify, to confirm the pattern repeats, to ensure your understanding is correct. 1 cycle might be coincidence. 2 cycles prove periodicity. Enmenluana's epoch was the great astronomical survey. The period when the sky was being mapped, not just for seasonal purposes, not just for agricultural timing, but for understanding cosmic mechanics, for recognizing that the universe operates according to mathematical law. That celestial motion is predictable. That time itself has structure. By the end of his reign, by the time those 12 Shah cycles concluded, astronomy was established. The Anunnaki understood planetary motions, stellar positions, eclipse cycles, and precession. They possessed knowledge that would guide Mesopotamian astronomy for millennia to come. 3 kings, 3 epochs, 3 phases of foundational work, location established, water mapped, cosmos understood. The first 67,200 years of Eridu's 241,200-year period. 5 more kings follow, each adding specific knowledge, each contributing essential understanding, each building on what previous epochs accomplished. The 4th king, Enmengal-Ana, reigns for 28,800 years. Another 8 Shah cycle. His epoch focuses on agriculture, on understanding plant growth cycles, on recognizing which plants are edible, which are useful, which can be cultivated. 28,800 years of botanical observation, of testing every plant, of mapping growing seasons through multiple climate regimes, of understanding agriculture not just in one climate, but across the full range of conditions Earth experiences through glacial cycles. By the end of this epoch, agriculture was understood. The knowledge that Mesopotamian farmers would later use appeared fully formed because it had been accumulated across 28,800 years of systematic observation and experiment. The 5th king, Dumuzid, reigns for 36,000 years. 10 Shah again. His domain was animal husbandry, understanding animal behavior, learning domestication, recognizing which species could be managed and which couldn't. 36,000 years of observing animals, of tracking migration patterns, of understanding breeding cycles, of experimenting with capture and containment, of developing the knowledge that would let humans manage sheep, goats, cattle. This knowledge didn't develop quickly. Domestication is subtle. Understanding animal psychology, breeding selection, and herd management takes generations of observation. 36,000 years provides those generations. Thousands of them. By the end of Dumuzid's epoch, animal husbandry was established. The Anunnaki knew which animals could be domesticated, how to manage them, how to breed them selectively for useful traits. The sixth king's name is partially damaged in most king list versions. His reign, 28,800 years, 8 Shah again. His focus appears to be on materials, on understanding soils, clays, building materials, on recognizing which materials are suitable for construction, for pottery, for tools. 28,800 years of material science, of testing every type of clay for pottery and brickmaking, of understanding which stones are useful for which purposes, of mapping where materials can be found and how to work them. This knowledge, too, would be inherited by Sumerians, who appeared with sophisticated understanding of materials from the beginning. Because that understanding had been accumulated across 8 Shah cycles of systematic exploration. The seventh king, Enmendur-Ana, reigns for 21,000 years. His name echoes the later Sipar king, but this is a different figure in a different city. His focus is on seasonal patterns, on understanding climate cycles at scales shorter than glacial periods, on recognizing annual rhythms, rainfall patterns, temperature variations, 21,000 years of weather observation, of mapping how seasons change, of understanding that patterns repeat but with variation, of developing the ability to predict weather over short terms and climate over long terms. This knowledge became the foundation for agricultural planning, for knowing when to plant and when to harvest, for recognizing signs of coming floods or droughts, knowledge the Sumerians possessed and used effectively. The eighth and final king of Eridu completes the sequence. His reign, 18,600 years. His name is lost to damage, but his role is clear from context, synthesis, integration, taking everything learned across the previous 7 epochs and organizing it into coherent understanding. 18,600 years of administrative work, of recording, of codifying, of creating the knowledge base that could be transmitted to the next phase of work in the next city. By the time this 8th king's reign concluded, by the time 241,200 years had passed since kingship first descended to Eridu, the foundational knowledge was complete. Location, water, cosmos, agriculture, animals, materials, climate, integration, everything essential for understanding and managing Earth's basic systems had been mapped. Everything necessary for supporting civilized life had been established. Every foundation upon which further development would build was in place. 241,200 years, 8 kings, 8 phases of work, 67 complete Shah cycles, the longest, deepest, most comprehensive phase of the entire pre-flood period. And when it was complete, when the foundations were solid, when the basic understanding was comprehensive, kingship moved from Eridu to Bad Tibira, from foundation work to specialized development, from basic systems to advanced techniques. The timeline continues, the chronology unfolds, the hidden structure reveals itself. 241,200 years establishing foundations, then 108,000 years developing technology, then 28,800 years mapping biology, then 21,000 years observing astronomy, then 18,600 years preparing for catastrophe. Each phase builds on previous work. Each epoch enables the next. Each stage contributes essential knowledge to the comprehensive understanding that would eventually be passed to humanity. This is the hidden timeline. This is what the numbers encode. This is what 241,200 years accomplished. the foundations of everything, the knowledge upon which all civilization would eventually build, the deep preparation that made human inheritance possible. The Anunnaki weren't idle during those vast spans. They were working, observing, mapping, understanding, establishing systems that would endure through catastrophe and into the human age. 241,200 years, the longest epoch, the deepest foundation, the period that made everything else possible, and it's all there, hidden in the king list, encoded in the reign lengths, preserved through careful copying across millennia, waiting for someone to finally read the numbers carefully enough to see what they're saying. The chronology is precise, the timeline is clear, the testimony is consistent. 241,200 years in Eridu, establishing the foundations of planetary organization, preparing Earth for the civilized life that would eventually emerge. The work was real, the timeline is documented, the hidden chronology speaks, and we're only 1/5 of the way through the full pre-flood period. 4 more phases remain, 4 more cities. 4 more stages of specialized development building toward the moment when the waters would rise and everything would change. The timeline continues. Let's keep following it. After 241,200 years, kingship leaves Eridu. The foundational work is complete. The basic systems are established. The planet is ready for the next phase, the next stage of development, the next level of sophistication. Kingship moves to Bad Tibira, the fortress of metalworkers, the city that would specialize in understanding materials at a deeper level, in transforming raw earth into useful tools, in developing the chemistry that would unlock technology. The transition marks a chronological milestone. After 241,200 years, we're now at 134,800 years before the flood. The timeline is moving forward. We're following the hidden chronology toward its culmination. Bad Tibira receives 3 kings. Not 8 like Eridu, not the foundational 8-fold pattern. 3, Trinity, the number of process, of transformation, of progression through stages, beginning, middle, end, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, raw ore, smelted metal, worked tool. 3 kings, 3 epochs, 3 phases of metallurgical development. The first king of Bad Tibira is Enmenluana, not the same as Eridu's Enmenluana, despite the similar name. This is a new figure in a new place focused on new work. His reign, 43,200 years, 12 complete Shah cycles, 12 again, cosmic completion, the same duration as Eridu's great astronomical observer, but focused differently, not on the sky but on the earth, not on celestial motions but on terrestrial materials. What requires 12 Shah cycles of material study? What takes 43,200 years to understand? Mining, geology, understanding where metals hide in the earth, recognizing ore deposits, learning to distinguish valuable minerals from worthless rock, mapping the underground distribution of copper, tin, gold, silver, iron. This isn't quick work. Ore doesn't announce itself. Copper ore looks like green-stained rock. Tin ore resembles dark pebbles. Iron ore could be mistaken for common stone. You need to test everything, sample widely, map comprehensively across vast geographical regions through multiple geological zones. 43,200 years provides time for comprehensive geological survey, time to map the entire region, time to understand where every useful material can be found, time to recognize the geological processes that concentrate metals in specific locations. By the end of Enmenluana's epoch, by the time those 12 Shah cycles concluded, geology was mapped. The Anunnaki knew where every metal deposit in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions could be found. They possessed knowledge that human miners would later use, seemingly appearing with sophisticated understanding of where to dig and what to look for. The second king of Bad Tibira is Enmen-Gal-Ana. His reign, 28,800 years, 8 Shah cycles, foundational completion applied to a specific domain. His focus, extraction, smelting, understanding how to get metal out of ore, how to use heat to separate valuable metal from worthless rock, how to reach temperatures high enough to melt different metals, how to manage the chemistry of reduction, of removing oxygen from metal oxides. This is sophisticated chemistry. You can't smelt copper at wood-fire temperatures. You need specialized furnaces. You need forced air to reach higher heat. You need to understand that certain materials, like charcoal, don't just provide heat, but participate in chemical reactions that extract metal from ore. 28,800 years of experimentation, of testing different furnace designs, of trying different fuel sources, of learning through failure what works and what doesn't, of gradually developing the techniques that make metallurgy possible. By the end of this epoch, smelting was established. The Anunnaki could extract copper from ore reliably, could produce metal consistently, could manage the process with precision. The third king of Bad Tibira is Dumuzid the Shepherd. His reign, 36,000 years, 10 Shah cycles, decimal completion, full development. His focus, alloying and working, understanding that metals can be combined to create new materials with different properties, that copper and tin create bronze, that ratios matter, that bronze can be cast, hammered, annealed, shaped into tools and weapons and art. 36,000 years of metallurgical refinement, of testing every possible combination, of discovering optimal ratios through experiment, of learning work hardening, annealing, casting techniques, of understanding how to make tools that actually work, that hold an edge, that don't break. This knowledge is extraordinarily complex. Modern metallurgy requires years of study to master. Imagine discovering it from scratch. Every principle learned through trial and error. Every technique developed through experimentation, every optimal ratio found through testing. 36,000 years becomes reasonable, even conservative, the time needed to genuinely master metalworking at a comprehensive level. By the end of Dumuzid's epoch, by the conclusion of Bad Tibira's third and final reign, metallurgy was complete. Mining, smelting, alloying, working, every stage understood. Every technique established, the full process mapped from ore in the ground to finished tool in the hand. Add up Bad Tibira's 3 reigns. 43,200 plus 28,800 plus 36,000 equals 108,000 years. Exactly 30 Shah cycles, 30, 3 times 10. The completion of completion, fullness of fullness, trinity multiplied by decimal perfection, 108,000 years developing metallurgy. Not excessive, not arbitrary, precise. The time actually required to map geology, master extraction, and perfect working at a comprehensive level. And when it was complete, when metallurgy was fully established, kingship moved again. From Bad Tibira to Larak, from technology to biology, from working earth to understanding life. The timeline advances. We're now at only 52,800 years before the flood. More than 400,000 years have passed since kingship first descended. More than 3/4 of the pre-flood period is behind us. The work is approaching completion. The preparation is nearly finished. Larak receives one king, En-Sipad-Zi-Ana, the healer. His reign, 28,800 years, 8 Shah cycles. The foundational 8-fold pattern applied to medicine, 28,800 years of biological observation, of testing every plant for healing properties, of understanding disease, of developing treatments, of mapping the pharmacological potential of Earth's biosphere. We discussed this earlier. The scope is vast. Millions of plant species, billions of chemical compounds, countless potential combinations. Testing all of it takes time. genuine, comprehensive time. Encypadziana's epoch provided that time. 8 complete Shah cycles, enough to test systematically, enough to map thoroughly, enough to develop the medical knowledge that Sumerian physicians would inherit and use with remarkable effectiveness. 28,800 years establishing medicine. By the end of this epoch, by the time Larak's single reign concluded, the Anunnaki possessed comprehensive knowledge of healing. What plants treated which conditions, what doses were safe, what combinations worked synergistically, what should never be mixed. This knowledge would be passed to human healers, would become the Sumerian medical texts prescribing treatments modern pharmacology has confirmed actually work, not primitive superstition. Genuine medicine accumulated across 28,800 years of systematic research. After Larak comes Sipar. After biology comes astronomy. After understanding life comes understanding the cosmos that contains it. We're now at 24,000 years before the flood. The timeline is accelerating toward catastrophe. Less than 3% of the pre-flood period remains. The work is nearly finished. Sipar receives one king, En-men-dur-ana, the Ascended One. His reign, 21,000 years, just under 6 Shah cycles, long enough to observe most of one complete precession cycle plus additional verification. 21,000 years mapping the sky, recording planetary positions, recognizing eclipse cycles, understanding that celestial mechanics are mathematical, predictable, governed by law. This knowledge would become the foundation of Mesopotamian astronomy, the ability to predict eclipses centuries in advance. The understanding of planetary periods, the recognition of precession, of the slow shift in stellar positions over vast timescales. The Sumerians inherited this knowledge complete. They didn't develop it gradually. They received it from the epoch when it was accumulated, from En-men-dur-ana's 21,000-year reign of continuous observation. By the end of Sipar's epoch, astronomy was established. The heavens were mapped. Celestial law was understood. The knowledge necessary for agricultural planning, religious timing, and calendar management was complete. One final city remains, one final phase, one final king before the flood. After Sipar comes Shurupak. After astronomy comes synthesis. After specialized development comes integration and preparation. We're now at 3,000 years before the flood. The final moments of the pre-flood age, the last phase before catastrophe, the period of making ready. Shurupak receives one king. Ubatutu, father of Ziusudra the flood hero. His reign, 18,600 years, just over 5 Shah cycles, 18,600 years of final preparation, of taking everything learned across the previous 437,400 years and synthesizing it, of recording it, of preparing it for transmission, of making ready for the catastrophe that geological signs were already predicting. Because by now, the Anunnaki knew. Climate was shifting. Glacial patterns were changing. Sea levels were rising. The flood wasn't sudden surprise. It was predictable geological transition. They had millennia of warning. Time to prepare. Time to record. Time to ensure knowledge would survive. Ubatutu's 18,600-year reign was that preparation period, administrative work, documentation, creating records that could survive catastrophe, training those who would carry knowledge forward, preparing for continuity across discontinuity. And then, at the end of those 18,600 years, the flood came. 456,000 years of work, 18 kings, 5 cities, countless accomplishments, comprehensive knowledge, systematic preparation, all of it documented, all of it preserved, all of it encoded in the hidden timeline that the Sumerians maintained with such care. 241,200 years in Eridu establishing foundations. 108,000 years in Bad Tibira developing metallurgy, 28,800 years in Larak mapping medicine, 21,000 years in Sipar understanding astronomy, 18,600 years in Shurapak preparing for catastrophe, the complete chronology, the full timeline, the 250,000+ years of pre-flood history that scholars dismiss as mythology, but that the Sumerians recorded as fact. And here's what makes it undeniable. The numbers are too precise, the progression is too logical, the structure is too coherent, the preservation is too consistent. If this were mythology, it would vary. Different cities would give different numbers, different versions would contradict each other. The chronology would be vague, approximate, symbolic, but it's not. Every version agrees. Every copy preserves the same reign lengths. Every text references the same chronology. The numbers are exact. The mathematics are perfect. The internal consistency is absolute. This is documentation, this is testimony. This is the Sumerians telling us exactly what happened and exactly how long it took. 241,200 years. The first age, the longest epoch, the deepest foundation, then 108,000 years, then 28,800 years, then 21,000 years, then 18,600 years. Each phase precisely measured, each epoch carefully recorded. Each stage of work documented with administrative thoroughness. The hidden timeline is hidden no longer. We've traced it, we've followed it, we've seen its structure and understood its precision. 456,000 years, the Anunnaki timeline, preserved in Sumerian records, encoded in the king list, waiting for us to finally read it carefully enough to understand what it's saying. The work happened. The timeline is real. The chronology stands. And the flood that ended it all is approaching. The final 3,000 years are ticking down. The catastrophe that will reset everything is coming. But before we reach that moment, before we trace those final years when the waters rose and civilization drowned, we need to understand something crucial about this timeline, something that transforms it from interesting historical curiosity into profound testimony about human origins. Because this timeline doesn't just document what the Anunnaki were doing, it explains why Sumerian civilization appeared so mysteriously complete. Why they possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had time to develop. Why their mathematics, astronomy, medicine and metallurgy were so sophisticated from the beginning. They inherited it, all of it, from the 456,000 years of work documented in the hidden timeline, and that inheritance explains everything. The clay tablets scattered across museums worldwide preserve more than just reign lengths and city names. They preserve testimony about the greatest knowledge transfer in human history. The moment when 456,000 years of accumulated understanding was passed from those who had developed it to those who would maintain it. From the Anunnaki to humanity, from teachers to students, from the age before the flood to the age after. This is what the timeline reveals when you read it completely, when you follow it from beginning to end, when you understand that it's not just documenting Anunnaki work, but explaining Sumerian inheritance. 241,200 years of foundational knowledge, location, water, cosmos, agriculture, animals, materials, climate, integration, all established during Eridu's long epoch. All passed to humanity after the flood. The Sumerians appeared knowing where to build cities, knowing how to manage water, knowing astronomical cycles, knowing agricultural timing, knowing animal husbandry, knowing materials and construction, knowing climate patterns, all sophisticated understanding that normally takes civilizations centuries to develop gradually. They had it immediately, from the beginning, because it wasn't new knowledge, it was inherited knowledge. accumulated across 241,200 years and passed forward across the catastrophe, 108,000 years of metallurgical knowledge, mining, smelting, alloying, working, all established during Bad Tibera's three epochs, all passed to humanity after the flood. The Sumerians appeared with sophisticated bronze working, knowing where to find ore, knowing how to smelt it, knowing optimal alloy ratios, knowing working techniques. All complex knowledge that normally takes civilizations generations to develop through trial and error. They had it from the start. Because it wasn't discovered, it was taught by those who had spent 108,000 years developing it during the Bad Tibera epochs, 28,800 years of medical knowledge, pharmacology, treatments, dosages, combinations, all established during Ensipadziana's Larak epoch, all passed to humanity after the flood. The Sumerians appeared with effective medicine, prescribing treatments that actually work, using combinations modern pharmacology has confirmed, knowing dosages and contraindications, all detailed knowledge that normally takes civilizations centuries of experimentation to accumulate. They had it immediately, because it wasn't experimented, it was inherited. From the 28,800 years of systematic research conducted during Larak's medical epoch, 21,000 years of astronomical knowledge, celestial mechanics, eclipse prediction, precession understanding, all established during Enmen-Durana's Sipar epoch, all passed to humanity after the flood. The Sumerians appeared tracking Venus with precision, predicting eclipses accurately, understanding precession impossibly early, using astronomical knowledge that normally takes civilizations millennia of observation to develop. They had it from the beginning. Because it wasn't observed, it was taught by those who had spent 21,000 years mapping the sky during Sipar's astronomical epoch. This is what the timeline explains. This is why Sumerian civilization appeared so impossibly sophisticated. This is why scholars struggled to explain how they knew so much so early. They inherited 456,000 years of accumulated knowledge. They received the complete package: foundation, technology, medicine, astronomy, everything. Transmitted across catastrophe, preserved through the flood, taught to the survivors and their descendants. The King List doesn't just document Anunnaki work, it explains human inheritance. It's a catalogue of everything we received, a chronology of how long each domain took to develop, a record of the comprehensive knowledge passed forward when the pre-flood age ended and the human age began. 241,200 years establishing foundations. We inherited that. 108,000 years developing technology. We inherited that. 28,800 years mapping medicine. We inherited that. 21,000 years understanding astronomy. We inherited that. 18,600 years preparing for transmission. That preparation made the inheritance possible. 456,000 years of work, all passed to humanity, all encoded in the hidden timeline, all preserved in the King List that scholars dismiss as mythology. But it's not mythology. It's a receipt, documentation of what we received, chronology of how long it took to accumulate, testimony about the greatest inheritance in history. We didn't invent civilization, we inherited it. The timeline proves it, the numbers document it. The Sumerians recorded it faithfully because they understood exactly what they were: inheritors, receivers. Continuers of work that began 456,000 years before them. This is what 241,200 years reveals. This is what the hidden timeline explains. This is what the Anunnaki chronology actually documents, not just what they did, but what they gave us, not just how long it took them, but how much we inherited, not just their work, but our foundation. Everything we are rests on those 456,000 years of preparation. Everything we know derives from that accumulated understanding. Everything we've accomplished builds on foundations laid across geological epochs. The timeline is testimony, the chronology is truth. The hidden numbers speak. 241,200 years in Eridu, establishing everything foundational that we inherited. And when you understand that, when you see the timeline completely, when you recognize that it's documenting inheritance rather than just work, everything changes. Sumerian civilization isn't mysterious anymore. It's logical, expected, inevitable. They inherited comprehensive knowledge and used it effectively. That's not mysterious. That's exactly what you'd expect from recipients of 456,000 years of accumulated understanding. The timeline explains it all. The numbers account for everything. The chronology resolves every question about why the Sumerians knew so much so early, because they received it from the age before the flood, from the 456,000 years of Anunnaki work, from the comprehensive preparation documented in the hidden timeline, 241,200 years, the first age, the longest epoch, the deepest foundation, the source of everything we inherited. The Sumerians knew this. They recorded it. They preserved it faithfully. They hoped we would eventually understand. And now, finally, after 5,000 years of written preservation, and who knows how many millennia of oral tradition before that, we're beginning to see what they were telling us. We are inheritors, receivers, continuers of work that spans almost 500,000 years, standing on foundations we didn't build, using knowledge we didn't develop, maintaining systems we didn't design. The timeline documents it. The numbers prove it. The testimony stands. 241,200 years before the flood. When it all began. When the work started. When the Anunnaki first arrived in Eridu and began the long preparation that would eventually make human civilization possible. And now we know. We finally understand. The hidden timeline has revealed its truth. We inherited 456,000 years of accumulated knowledge. And we've been living on that inheritance ever since. The clay speaks, the numbers testify, the chronology stands. 241,200 years, the foundation of everything. May we prove worthy of all that time, all that work, all that preparation that made us possible. But there's one more element hidden in this timeline that we haven't fully explored yet. One more layer of meaning encoded in those 241,200 years. One more reason why this chronology matters so profoundly. The timeline doesn't just document past work or explain human inheritance. It establishes context for understanding our present, for recognizing where we are in the larger story, for seeing our civilization not as an isolated phenomenon, but as one chapter in a much longer narrative. Think about the proportions. 456,000 years of pre-flood preparation, then catastrophe, then roughly 6,000 years of post-flood human civilization. The ratio is staggering, 76-1. For every year of documented human history, there were 76 years of pre-flood preparation. Put differently, human civilization as we know it, from the first Sumerian cities to the present day, represents only 1.3% of the total timeline documented in the King list, only 1.3%. We are the latest, briefest chapter in a story that stretches back almost 500,000 years. This isn't humiliating. It's contextualizing. It places us appropriately within the vast scope of planetary organization. We're not the beginning. We're not the culmination. We're the continuation, the inheritors, the current maintainers of systems established across geological epochs. And recognizing that changes how we should understand our role. We're not masters of the earth, free to exploit it however we wish. We're stewards of the earth, responsible for maintaining what was prepared across 456,000 years of work. Maintaining it, not destroying it, not depleting it, not treating it as ours to consume. The timeline implies responsibility, custodianship, continuation of the work, rather than abandonment of it. 241,200 years establishing foundational systems, water, climate, biological diversity, atmospheric balance, geological stability. All the systems that make Earth habitable weren't random cosmic accidents. They were organized, managed, maintained across vast timescales. And now those systems are ours to maintain, ours to continue managing, ours to preserve for whatever comes next. The Sumerians understood this. Their entire civilization was structured around maintenance of cosmic order, Ma'at in Egyptian terms, Rita in Hindu terms. The Sumerians called it Me, divine principles that govern reality and that must be maintained through proper ritual, proper action, proper stewardship. They didn't see themselves as independent agents free to do whatever they wished. They saw themselves as maintaining what had been established, continuing what had been begun, stewarding what had been entrusted to them. And the timeline explains why they understood themselves that way, because they knew the history. They preserved the chronology. They remembered that 456,000 years of work preceded their own civilization. They recognized they were inheritors of that work and therefore responsible for continuing it. We've forgotten that understanding. Modern civilization sees itself as independent, self-made, beholden to nothing but its own desires and ambitions. We treat the planet as raw resource to exploit. We deplete systems without considering maintenance. We operate as though we're the first and only inhabitants that matter, but the timeline whispers differently, whispers that we're not the first, whispers that systems we depend on were organized across spans of time we can barely comprehend, whispers that maintenance matters, whispers that we carry responsibility for continuing what was begun long before we existed. 241,200 years establishing foundations. Are we maintaining them, or are we letting them degrade through neglect and exploitation? 108,000 years developing technology. Are we using that inheritance wisely, or are we deploying it destructively without considering consequences? 28,800 years mapping medicine. Are we preserving that knowledge? Or are we losing traditional understanding in favor of approaches that ignore accumulated wisdom? 21,000 years understanding astronomy. Are we maintaining awareness of cosmic context, or are we forgetting that we're part of larger cycles and systems? 18,600 years preparing for catastrophe. Are we learning from that preparation, or are we ignoring warnings about environmental instability? The timeline poses these questions. It implies accountability. It suggests that inheritance comes with obligation. That receiving 456,000 years of accumulated knowledge means accepting responsibility for maintaining what that knowledge makes possible. The Sumerians accepted that responsibility. They structured their entire civilization around it. They maintained temples as centers of cosmic order. They performed rituals, ensuring continued function of natural systems. They preserved knowledge across generations. They understood themselves as links in a chain, stretching back to the time before the flood and forward to whatever would come after them. We've broken that chain. We've forgotten we're links. We've imagined ourselves as independent, as self-sufficient, as owing nothing to the past and nothing to the future. But the timeline reminds us otherwise, reminds us that we're part of something vastly larger and vastly older than our brief civilizational moment. Reminds us that the systems we depend on were organized across geological epochs, reminds us that maintenance matters, reminds us that we're inheritors and therefore responsible. 241,200 years, the longest epoch, the deepest foundation, the period when everything essential was established. Are we maintaining what was established, or are we squandering the inheritance? The timeline asks that question, quietly, persistently, unavoidably. And perhaps that's the most important thing the hidden chronology reveals. Not just what happened before the flood, not just what the Anunnaki were doing across those vast spans, not just how human civilization inherited comprehensive knowledge, but what we should be doing now, how we should understand our role, what responsibilities come with being the current inheritors of 456,000 years of planetary organization. The Sumerians knew. They preserved the timeline to help us remember. They encoded the chronology to help us understand context. They maintained the testimony to help us recognize our place in the longer story. 241,200 years before the flood, when foundations were laid, when systems were established, when the work began that we're now tasked with continuing. May we remember. May we maintain. May we prove worthy of the inheritance. The timeline speaks. The chronology teaches. The hidden numbers reveal not just the past, but our present responsibility. We are links in a chain, stretching back almost 500,000 years. Links connecting the work before the flood to whatever comes after us. Links that either maintain continuity or break it through negligence and forgetting. The Sumerians were faithful links. They received the inheritance and passed it forward. They preserved the timeline and transmitted it. They understood, and they acted according to that understanding. Can we say the same? Will we be faithful links? Will we maintain what we've inherited? Will we pass it forward intact? The timeline asks. Quietly, persistently, unavoidably. 241,200 years. The foundation of everything, the inheritance that made us possible, the work that established the systems we depend on. May we remember. May we maintain. May we continue. That's what the hidden chronology ultimately reveals. That's what 241,200 years truly means. That's what the Anunnaki timeline preserved in Sumerian records is actually telling us. We are inheritors. We carry responsibility. We must maintain what we've received. The clay speaks. The numbers testify. The chronology stands. 241,200 years, the longest epoch, the deepest foundation, the work that made everything possible. And now it's ours to continue. As we approach the end of tonight's journey, as sleep begins to pull you gently down, as the ancient numbers fade into the background hum of consciousness shifting toward dreams, take with you this final understanding. You are part of something ancient, something purposeful, something that stretches back almost 500,000 years and forward into a future we can barely imagine. The Anunnaki organized a planet across 456,000 years of systematic work, 241,200 years establishing foundations in Eridu alone, then phases of specialized development, then catastrophe. Then transmission of accumulated knowledge to humanity. Then us, now, here, inheritors of that vast span of preparation. We didn't earn this inheritance through our own accomplishments. We received it. The knowledge, the systems, the organized planet capable of supporting civilized life, all given, all inherited, all maintained across the catastrophe that could have destroyed it, and now it's ours, to maintain or to squander, to continue or to break, to honor or to forget. The Sumerians chose maintenance, chose continuation, chose honor. They preserved the timeline so we would know, so we would remember, so we would understand our place in the vast story and act accordingly. That scribe at Nippur, pressing stylus to clay 4,000 years ago, copying a text already ancient, preserving numbers already incomprehensible, didn't know you, couldn't imagine you, but they were writing for you anyway, passing the testimony forward, building a bridge across time, hoping someone someday would finally understand what those impossible numbers mean. You understand now. You've followed the timeline. You've traced the hidden chronology. You've seen the structure and recognized its truth. 241,200 years in Eridu, 108,000 years in Bad Tibira, 28,800 years in Larak, 21,000 years in Sipar, 18,600 years in Shurupak, 456,000 years total. The work before the flood, the preparation that made human civilization possible, and you are the continuation of that work. The current link in a chain stretching back almost 500,000 years, the present inheritor of accumulated knowledge established across geological epochs. That's who you are. That's what you carry. That's the responsibility you bear, whether you recognize it or not. The timeline has revealed itself. The hidden chronology has spoken. The numbers have testified. Now you know, and knowing you bear responsibility to maintain, to continue, to pass forward. To be a faithful link connecting the vast past to the unknown future. Sleep well with that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that you're part of something far larger and far older than you were taught to believe. Dream of deep time, of epochs spanning millennia, of work accomplished across geological spans. And when you wake, remember the timeline, remember the chronology, remember what 241,200 years really means. Foundations, inheritance, responsibility, continuation. If you found value in this journey through deep time, if it changed how you see yourself and your place in the longer story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me how this timeline struck you, what questions it raised, what responsibilities it implies, and tell me where you are, what time it is in your world, how you're feeling as these ancient numbers settle into your consciousness. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the globe, united by curiosity about the same impossible chronology, all of us inheritors of the same 456,000-year preparation. The archive will close, the lights will dim, the tablets will rest in their climate-controlled darkness, but the testimony doesn't sleep, the numbers don't fade. The chronology stands eternal. 241,200 years before the flood. When kingship first descended to Eridu, when the Anunnaki began the long work of organizing a planet, when the foundations were laid that we still stand upon. The hidden timeline is hidden no longer. We've traced it completely. We've followed it from beginning to end. We've seen what those vast spans accomplished and what they mean for us now. 456,000 years of work, all documented, all preserved, all encoded in numbers that scholars dismiss, but that speak truth to those willing to listen. The Sumerians were right. The chronology was real. The timeline was accurate. The testimony was true. We are inheritors of almost 500,000 years of accumulated knowledge. And that inheritance defines who we are, what we carry, and what we're responsible for continuing. Sleep well in that knowledge, rest in that understanding. Dream of deep time and ancient work, and the long chain connecting past to present to future. The clay has spoken, the timeline has revealed itself. The hidden chronology stands exposed at last. 241,200 years, the foundation of everything. The work that made us possible, the inheritance that defines us still. May we prove worthy of all that time, all that work, all that preparation. May we maintain what we've received. May we continue what was begun. May we pass forward what was passed to us. That's what the timeline asks. That's what 241,200 years means. That's what the Anunnaki chronology hidden in Sumerian records has been trying to tell us for 5,000 years. We finally understand, we finally see, we finally know. And now, knowing, we bear the weight and the privilege of inheritance. Good night. Sleep deeply. And remember, you are part of something ancient, something vast. Something that stretches back almost 500,000 years. The timeline is real, the chronology stands, the testimony endures. 241,200 years before the flood, when everything began, when foundations were laid, when the work started that we continue still. The Anunnaki were here first, for almost 500,000 years, preparing the planet, accumulating knowledge, establishing systems, and then they gave it all to us. That's what the hidden timeline reveals. That's what the numbers say. That's what the Sumerians preserved so faithfully. We are inheritors. We are continuers. We are links in an ancient chain. May we never forget. The clay remembers. The numbers testify. The chronology stands. 241,200 years, the foundation of everything. Rest well in that truth. The silence deepens. But before sleep claims you completely, before the ancient numbers dissolve into dreams, there's one more thread we need to follow. One more element hidden within the timeline that transforms everything we've discussed from interesting historical speculation into something far more immediate, far more urgent, far more personally relevant, because the timeline doesn't just document the past, it predicts patterns, it reveals cycles. And when you understand those cycles, when you see how they operated across the pre-flood period, you begin to recognize something unsettling about our current moment in history. We might be living through another transition point, another moment when cycles complete and systems reset, another epoch ending with all the implications that carries. Let's trace the pattern one more time, but now watching for what it reveals about cycles, about periodicities, about the rhythms that governed those 456,000 years and that might still be governing our own time. The Sumerian king list divides pre-flood time into distinct epochs, not arbitrarily. Systematically, each epoch marked by specific durations, each phase measured in Shah cycles, and when you examine those cycles carefully, when you plot them against geological and astronomical data, correlations emerge that are difficult to dismiss. The Shah, that 3,600-year unit, is suspiciously close to several natural cycles. Not exact, but close enough to suggest the Sumerians were encoding actual periodicities rather than inventing symbolic numbers. Glacial interglacial transitions follow roughly 100,000-year cycles, with smaller fluctuations nested within them. Milankovitch cycles, the orbital variations that drive ice ages, operate on timescales of 23,000, 41,000, and 100,000 years. Solar activity follows multi-millennial cycles. Magnetic pole reversals occur irregularly but cluster around certain periods. The 8 Shah epochs in Eridu, totaling 241,200 years, span multiple complete glacial cycles. The Anunnaki's foundational work occurred across the full range of climate variability Earth experiences. They mapped systems not in one climate state but across all climate states. That's why the knowledge was so comprehensive. It was tested through every condition. But here's what matters for us. Those cycles continue. They didn't stop when the flood ended the pre-flood age. They didn't pause when humanity inherited the organized planet. They're still operating, still driving climate, still influencing geological stability, still governing the deep rhythms of planetary systems, and we're approaching transition points in several of those cycles simultaneously. The current interglacial period, the Holocene, has lasted roughly 11,700 years since the last glacial maximum. That's approaching the typical duration of interglacial warmth before the next glacial advance. Climate is beginning to show signs of instability. Weather patterns are shifting. Systems are becoming unpredictable. Magnetic pole reversal appears to be accelerating. The North Magnetic Pole has moved over 1,000 miles in the past century, with acceleration increasing. We're either approaching a reversal or experiencing major magnetic excursion. Either way, it's a sign of deep planetary systems in flux. Solar activity is entering a period of reduced output, possibly the beginning of a grand solar minimum like those that have triggered climate disruptions in historical times. Multiple cycles converging, multiple systems showing instability, multiple signs that we're approaching another transition point, another moment when continuity might break and everything might change. Just like it did 241,200 years ago when the Anunnaki recognized instability and began their work. Just like it did at the flood, when catastrophe reset everything and inheritance became necessary. We're not at the flood yet. The signs aren't that extreme, but we're at a transition, and transitions require response, require adaptation, require understanding what's happening and why. The timeline helps with that understanding. It shows us that transitions are natural, that they've happened before, that systems experience instability periodically, that recognizing the signs and responding appropriately is how continuity survives discontinuity. The Anunnaki recognized transition, responded by organizing systems to handle variability, spent 241,200 years making Earth stable enough to survive climate shifts. The pre-flood civilization recognized approaching catastrophe, responded by recording knowledge, spent 18,600 years preparing for transmission across disaster. We are recognizing transition now, multiple systems showing instability, multiple cycles converging, multiple signs that change is coming whether we're prepared or not. The question is how we respond. Do we maintain? Do we adapt? Do we preserve knowledge and systems so they survive whatever transition brings? Or do we ignore the signs and let systems degrade until collapse becomes inevitable? The timeline suggests that maintenance matters more during transitions, that understanding cycles allows appropriate response, that preparing for instability is how continuity survives. 241,200 years of foundational work wasn't excessive. It was necessary, because it established systems stable enough to handle the full range of climate variability, robust enough to survive transitions, resilient enough to continue functioning when conditions shift. We inherited those stable systems. But stability requires maintenance, requires understanding what makes systems resilient, requires recognizing when we're approaching transition points and responding accordingly. The Sumerians understood this. Their civilization lasted over 1,000 years because they maintained systems. They recognized transitions and adapted. They preserved knowledge across disruptions. They understood they were inheritors, responsible for continuing what had been established across geological epochs. Modern civilization has lasted roughly 300 years in its industrial form, 1/3 the duration of Sumerian civilization, and we're already showing signs of system stress, environmental degradation, resource depletion, climate instability, social fragmentation, not because the inherited systems failed, but because we stopped maintaining them. We treated the planet as infinite resource rather than finite inheritance requiring stewardship. We ignored the cycles. We dismissed the signs. We operated as though transitions don't happen and systems don't require maintenance. The timeline warns otherwise. It shows that cycles continue, that transitions happen, that maintenance matters. That understanding your place in the longer chronology helps you respond appropriately to the moment you're living through. 241,200 years, not just history, pattern, template. evidence that long-term stability requires comprehensive understanding and continuous maintenance. We're living through a transition. Multiple cycles converging, multiple systems showing instability. The timeline suggests this is normal, natural, part of the deep rhythms governing planetary systems, but it also suggests that how we respond matters. That maintaining inherited systems helps them survive transitions. That understanding cycles allows appropriate adaptation. That preserving knowledge ensures continuity across discontinuity. The Anunnaki demonstrated this across 456,000 years. The Sumerians applied those lessons across their own civilization. Now it's our turn, our transition, our responsibility to respond appropriately. The timeline has given us the template. The chronology has shown us the pattern. The hidden numbers have revealed what worked across geological spans of time: maintenance, adaptation, preservation, continuation. These aren't abstract virtues, they're practical necessities, especially during transitions, especially when cycles converge and systems show instability. We're approaching such a moment now. The timeline helps us recognize it, helps us understand it, helps us see what response looks like based on what worked across almost 500,000 years of planetary organization. This isn't doom prophecy, it's pattern recognition. It's understanding that the cycles documented in the pre-flood chronology continue operating, that we're part of those cycles, whether we acknowledge them or not. That transitions happen periodically and require appropriate response. 241,200 years, establishing systems stable enough to handle climate variability. Those systems still function, but they require maintenance, and transitions stress systems more than stable periods do. Are we maintaining? Are we adapting? Are we preserving? Are we responding to the transition we're living through with the understanding that 456,000 years of accumulated knowledge provides? Or are we ignoring the cycles, dismissing the timeline, operating as though we're independent of the deep patterns that govern planetary systems? The clay speaks warnings. The numbers show patterns. The chronology reveals cycles that continue operating. We're approaching transition. Multiple systems showing instability. Multiple cycles converging. Multiple signs that change is coming. How we respond will determine whether we're faithful inheritors or the generation that broke the chain. Whether we maintain continuity or allow collapse. Whether we prove worthy of 456,000 years of preparation or squander the inheritance through negligence and ignorance. The timeline has given us the knowledge we need. The chronology has shown us the patterns. The hidden numbers have revealed what works across geological time. Now it's up to us to maintain, to adapt, to preserve, to continue. We're living through a transition, just like the Anunnaki lived through transitions during their work, just like the pre-flood civilization lived through the transition that became the flood, just like every epoch experiences transitions that test whether systems will survive. The difference is knowledge, understanding, awareness that transitions happen and that appropriate response makes survival possible. We have that knowledge now. We've traced the timeline. We've seen the patterns. We've recognized the cycles. What we do with that knowledge determines everything. Sleep on that thought. Let it settle deep. Let it integrate with everything else we've explored tonight. Let it shape how you see the world when you wake. You're living through a transition. Part of cycles that stretch back almost 500,000 years, connected to patterns that continue operating regardless of whether we acknowledge them. The timeline has revealed itself. The chronology has spoken. The hidden numbers have taught their lesson. Maintenance during transitions, adaptation to changing conditions, preservation of knowledge across disruptions, continuation of the work despite instability. That's what 241,200 years teaches. That's what the Anunnaki timeline ultimately means. That's what the Sumerians preserved so faithfully for so long. Not just history, instruction, template for surviving transitions, evidence that long-term continuity requires understanding cycles and responding appropriately. We're approaching transition now. The cycles are converging. The signs are appearing. The timeline helps us recognize what's happening and what response looks like. May we respond wisely. May we maintain faithfully. May we prove worthy of the inheritance. The clay has spoken its warning. The numbers have revealed their pattern. The chronology has shown its cycle. We're living through transition, just like they did. The question is whether we'll respond like they did, with understanding, with maintenance, with preservation, with continuation. The timeline has given us everything we need to know. Now we must act accordingly. Rest in that knowledge. Sleep with that understanding. Wake with that responsibility. 241,200 years, the foundation that established stable systems, the work that made survival through transitions possible, the inheritance that we must now maintain through our own transition. The cycles continue, the patterns persist, the timeline teaches. May we learn, may we adapt, may we survive. That's what the hidden chronology ultimately reveals. That's what the Anunnaki timeline preserved in Sumerian records truly means. That's what 241,200 years is really telling us. We're part of continuing cycles, living through recurring patterns, inheritors responsible for maintaining systems through transition. The timeline has spoken. The warning is clear. The instruction is evident. Now we must choose how we respond. But there's something else, something even more profound hidden in those numbers. Something that explains not just what the Anunnaki were doing or what we've inherited, but why the timeline was preserved so carefully. Why the Sumerians treated these numbers as sacred. Why generation after generation of scribes copied them faithfully, despite not fully understanding their meaning. Because the timeline isn't just documentation or instruction, it's prophecy, not in a mystical sense, but in a mathematical one. The cycles it encodes don't just describe the past. They predict the future. They show when transitions happen, when systems become unstable, when continuity might break. And if you calculate forward from the flood, if you apply the same Shah mathematics that measured the pre-flood epochs, if you recognize that cycles continue operating in the post-flood age just as they did before it, you arrive at dates that should make us pay very close attention. The flood occurred roughly 4,500 years ago, based on archaeological evidence from the silt layers at Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish. Call it 2,500 years before the Common Era, a major catastrophic transition that reset civilization. One Shah is 3,600 years. If Shah cycles continue operating, if they mark transition points, when is the next Shah completion after the flood? 2,500 BCE plus 3,600 years equals 1,100 CE. The medieval warm period, major climate shift, significant historical transitions across multiple civilizations, system changes, the end of the classical period and emergence of medieval culture. Another Shah forward. 1,100 CE plus 3,600 years equals 4,700 CE, far future. But notice the pattern. Notice that Shah cycles correlate with major transition points, with moments when systems shift and civilizations transform. But there are smaller cycles nested within the Shah. 8 Shah cycles equal 1 Eridu phase, but within that, smaller rhythms operate. Quarter Shah cycles, 900-year periods. And those correlate even more precisely with historical transitions. The Bronze Age collapse around 1,200 BCE, 900 years after the flood. Quarter Shah, the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages around 500 CE. 1800 years after the flood, Half-Shah, the Industrial Revolution around 1800 CE, 4,300 years after the flood, just over one Shah. Another major transition. And now, we're 4,500 years past the flood, 1¼ Shah cycles, approaching another transition point. Multiple systems showing instability, multiple cycles converging. The timeline predicted this, the mathematics encoded it, the Shah cycles mark it. We're at a transition point, not because of mystical prophecy, but because of mathematical periodicity. The same cycles that governed pre-flood epochs continue governing post-flood history. And those cycles are bringing us to another moment of potential discontinuity. This is why the Sumerians preserved the timeline so carefully, not just to document the past, but to mark the future, to give their descendants the mathematical tools to recognize when transitions approach, to provide the chronological framework for understanding when maintenance becomes most critical. They knew cycles continue. They knew transitions repeat. They knew that understanding Shah mathematics would help future generations recognize what moment they were living through and respond appropriately. We're living through such a moment now. 4,500 years past the flood. Multiple cycles converging, multiple systems unstable. All the signs that the timeline's mathematics predict should appear at transition points. This isn't doom prophecy. It's pattern recognition. Mathematical extrapolation based on cycles that have operated for almost 500,000 years. The same cycles that the Anunnaki mapped during their work. The same periodicities that governed pre-flood epochs. The same rhythms that continue operating regardless of human awareness. But here's the crucial point, the reason this matters beyond abstract pattern recognition. Transitions aren't predetermined doom. They're moments of potential change. Moments when systems either adapt and survive or fail to adapt and collapse. Moments when appropriate response determines outcome. The Anunnaki responded to transition by organizing systems across 241,200 years, by making Earth stable enough to handle climate variability, by establishing knowledge comprehensive enough to survive disruption. The pre-flood civilization responded to approaching catastrophe by preserving knowledge, by spending 18,600 years preparing for transmission, by ensuring continuity across discontinuity. We're responding to our transition how? By maintaining inherited systems, by preserving accumulated knowledge, by preparing for potential disruption, by understanding we're at a mathematically predictable moment when cycles converge and appropriate response becomes critical, or by ignoring the signs, by depleting systems, by forgetting knowledge, by operating as though transitions don't happen and cycles don't matter. The timeline shows us what works. 241,200 years of evidence, 456,000 years of demonstration. Mathematical proof that long-term stability requires understanding cycles and responding to transitions appropriately. We're at such a transition now. The mathematics predict it, the signs confirm it, the timeline warned us it was coming. How we respond determines whether we continue the chain or break it. Whether we prove worthy inheritors or the generation that squandered 456,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The choice is ours. The moment is now. The transition is happening whether we acknowledge it or not. But the timeline has given us everything we need. The chronology has shown us the pattern. The mathematics have revealed when transitions occur and what response looks like. 241,200 years establishing systems, 108,000 years developing technology, 28,800 years mapping biology, 21,000 years understanding astronomy, 18,600 years preparing for catastrophe, all of it relevant now, all of it applicable to our current transition, all of it preserved so that we would have the knowledge necessary to respond appropriately when cycles converged and our own transition arrived. The Sumerians knew this day would come, knew that roughly 4,500 years after the flood, another transition would approach, knew that their descendants would need the timeline to recognize the moment and understand how to respond. They preserved it faithfully, copied it generation after generation, treated it as sacred knowledge because it was, because it contained mathematical prophecy based on actual cycles, because it provided the template for surviving transitions. And now we have it, the complete timeline, the hidden chronology, the mathematical framework that shows we're living through exactly the kind of moment the Sumerians warned about. 1¼ Shah cycles after the flood, multiple smaller cycles converging, all the mathematical signs that transition approaches, all the environmental signs confirming the mathematics. We're here. The moment the timeline pointed toward, the transition it warned about, the convergence it predicted, and we have the knowledge to respond appropriately. The understanding that 456,000 years of work provides, the template that shows what stability requires, maintenance, preservation, adaptation, continuation, not abstract virtues but practical necessities, especially now, especially at transition points, especially when cycles converge and systems show instability. The timeline has fulfilled its purpose. It documented the past. It explained the inheritance. It warned about the future. It showed what appropriate response looks like. Now it's our turn, our transition, our moment to demonstrate whether we learned from 456,000 years of accumulated wisdom or whether we ignored it and paid the consequences. The mathematics are clear. The cycles are converging. The transition is here. How we respond determines everything. Sleep on that knowledge. Let it integrate deeply. Let it shape how you see the world and your role in it. Let it guide your choices going forward. You're living at a mathematically significant moment, a transition point predicted by cycles operating for almost 500,000 years. A convergence the timeline warned about and that we now have opportunity to respond to appropriately. The Anunnaki prepared for transitions across 241,200 years. The pre-flood civilization prepared across 18,600 years. How long will we prepare? How seriously will we take the warning? How faithfully will we apply the accumulated wisdom? The timeline has spoken. The prophecy is mathematical, not mystical. The transition is here, predictable and real. We must respond appropriately, wisely, urgently. That's what 241,200 years ultimately teaches. That's what the hidden chronology truly reveals. That's what the Anunnaki timeline preserved in Sumerian records really means. Not just history, prophecy. Mathematical prediction that transitions recur cyclically and that we're living through one now. The knowledge is ours. The warning is clear. The template is provided. Now we must act before the transition becomes catastrophe, before systems collapse beyond repair, before we lose what 456,000 years of work established. The timeline has done its job. It's preserved the knowledge, transmitted the warning, shown the pattern. Now we must do ours. Maintain, preserve, adapt, continue, while there's still time, while systems can still be stabilized, while knowledge can still be applied. The transition is here. The mathematics don't lie. The cycles converge. We must respond now, appropriately, urgently. That's the final revelation of the hidden timeline. That's what 241,200 years has been trying to tell us all along. We're at the transition, the moment it predicted, the convergence it warned about. May we respond wisely. May we apply the knowledge. May we prove worthy of the inheritance. The clay has spoken its prophecy. The numbers have revealed their warning. The chronology has shown its pattern. 1¼ Shah cycles after the flood. At the mathematically predicted transition point, living through the moment the timeline pointed toward, we're here, now, at the convergence. May we respond appropriately. May we survive the transition. May we continue the chain. 241,200 years, the foundation, the warning, the prophecy, all preserved for this moment, for us, for now. May we listen, may we learn, may we act before it's too late. The timeline has fulfilled its purpose. Now we must fulfill ours. Maintain, preserve, continue through the transition into whatever comes next. The cycles demand it. The mathematics predict it. The inheritance requires it. We are the generation living at convergence, at transition, at the mathematically significant moment when response determines survival. May we respond appropriately. The timeline has shown us how. 241,200 years of wisdom, all waiting for this moment, all preserved for us, all relevant now. May we use it wisely, sleep with that responsibility, wake with that understanding, act with that urgency. We're at the transition the timeline predicted, the moment the mathematics pointed toward, the convergence the cycles demanded. Our response determines everything. The clay has spoken, the numbers have warned, the chronology has revealed. Now we must act. Good night. And when you wake, remember, you're living at a transition point predicted by cycles operating for almost 500,000 years. How you respond matters more than you can possibly imagine. The timeline has given you everything you need to know. Now you must use it, before the transition becomes catastrophe. Before the opportunity passes, before it's too late. 241,200 years, the warning was preserved. Now we must heed it.